Margaret Collins took a deep breath before pushing open the bathroom door. She needed just one moment of quiet, a single moment before changing her life forever. What she found on the other side froze every part of her body. Daniel and Emily, together, in a way no bride should ever discover, less than 10 minutes before walking down the aisle. For a few seconds, time stood still. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked, memorized every detail, and silently closed the door. Outside, the guests waited with smiling faces. No one knew that in that very moment, something inside her had changed forever. To understand what Margaret felt in that bathroom, you first need to understand who she was before that day. Margaret Collins grew up learning that love meant sacrifice. The oldest daughter of a simple Midwestern family, she took on responsibilities far too early. While other young women planned their futures, Margaret was paying medical bills and caring for her ailing mother. Marriage never came. Relationships were swallowed by obligation. And Emily, the adopted sister her parents had welcomed years before, always showed up in hard times, with new debts and old promises. At 67, Margaret finally believed it was her turn. She was wrong. Daniel Harper entered Margaret's life the way good things do when your guard is down. Slowly, gently, without warning. He was a widower, polite, punctual on Sunday mornings at church. He spoke calmly and listened carefully, something Margaret had rarely experienced. Within months, coffees after service turned into dinners, and dinners turned into plans. The community approved, the family encouraged. Even Emily, who rarely showed interest in her sister's life, began appearing more often. She asked about Daniel. She smiled whenever his name came up. Margaret took that as affection. Now she knows it was something else entirely. Looking back, Margaret could identify every single sign. They had always been there. Small, discreet, hidden behind reasonable explanations. Daniel canceled plans at the last minute, always with a valid excuse. Margaret understood. After all, she'd spent years putting everyone else first. Emily began asking for money more frequently. Small amounts, elaborate stories, and every now and then, she mentioned Daniel in a way that felt different, too familiar for someone who barely knew him. One afternoon, Margaret walked into the living room and found them talking in low voices. Both stopped immediately. "We were talking about a wedding surprise," Emily explained, smiling. Margaret believed her, because sometimes when you want something to be true badly enough, you choose to believe. The wedding was set for a Saturday afternoon at a simple hotel in the center of town. Nothing extravagant, just white flowers, a few rows of chairs, and people Margaret had known for years. She woke up that day with a strange feeling in her chest. It wasn't nerves, it was something heavier, quieter. But Margaret knew that inner voice well, and for years she had chosen to ignore it. While she got ready, Emily was there. She helped with the dress, commented on the hair, smiled in the photos. Everything seemed normal. It was only when Margaret stepped out to breathe, minutes before the ceremony, that reality found her in the hallway and led her to that bathroom door she never should have opened. Or perhaps should have opened much sooner. Margaret closed the bathroom door and stood still in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds. She counted every one of them. Then she straightened her dress, took a deep breath, and walked back to the ceremony. Yes, she walked down the aisle, not out of weakness, not out of naivety. Margaret Collins had spent 67 years learning to control what she showed the world, and in that moment, she made a cold, calculated decision. She would reveal nothing. Not yet. As the pastor spoke, she observed Daniel's smile, Emily's eyes avoiding hers. The emotional guest, completely unaware. Margaret said, "I do," in a steady voice, and while everyone celebrated, she began quietly making plans. Because there are two ways to respond to betrayal, and Margaret had chosen the most dangerous one. In the days that followed, Margaret acted like any ordinary bride. She thanked guests for gifts, replied to messages, smiled in photos. But at night, while Daniel slept, she investigated. She started with the bank statements, then moved to old messages on a tablet Daniel rarely locked. The records told a different story. Meetings scheduled on the same days he canceled plans with Margaret. Small transfers to a number she quickly recognized. Emily's number. There were also conversations about the inheritance. Margaret's parents' house had been sold months earlier. The amount, modest but real, sat in her account, and Daniel knew exactly how much it was. Margaret didn't cry. She simply documented everything quietly. The betrayal was serious. The financial plan was worse. Carrying that secret had a price. Margaret began feeling her body reacting to what her mind was trying to control. Headaches that wouldn't go away. Sleepless nights. A deep fatigue that wasn't only physical. She had been putting off medical appointments for months. First because of the wedding rush, then because of the silent investigation. But the body doesn't wait. One morning, Daniel found her sitting at the table, pale. "Are you all right?" he asked, in that calm voice she had once loved. "I'm fine," Margaret answered, smiling. It was a lie, but she had learned from the best. That same afternoon, she scheduled 2 appointments, one with her doctor, another with a lawyer. For the first time in a long time, Margaret was putting herself first. David Mercer's office was on the second floor of an old building downtown. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, a folder under her arm containing everything she had documented. David was a quiet man, with white hair and thin glasses. He listened to everything without interrupting. When Margaret finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds. "You were very methodical," he said with genuine respect in his voice. Margaret simply replied, "I had good teachers. Life taught me to solve problems on my own." David explained the options: marriage annulment, asset protection, formal documentation of the financial manipulation attempts. It was a long road. But there was a road. Margaret left the office different from how she had entered. Not lighter, there was still much ahead, but with something she had lost long ago: direction. Margaret chose a Sunday afternoon for the confrontation. Not for symbolism, but because Daniel would be home and Emily had been invited for dinner. Both of them in the same place at the same time. She set the table normally, served tea, waited. When both were seated, Margaret opened the folder on the table without saying a word. Statements, messages, dates, transfers, everything organized, printed, numbered. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel tried to speak first. Margaret raised her hand gently. "You don't need to explain. I already know everything." Emily turned pale. Daniel stared at the folder, unable to meet her eyes. There were no screams, no tears, just the truth, filling every corner of the room. And for the first time in 67 years, Margaret needed nothing more than that. Daniel was the first to leave, without bags, without words. He simply grabbed his car keys and closed the door carefully, as if he could still preserve some dignity in that gesture. Emily sat for a few minutes, staring at the table. "I needed money," she finally said in a low voice. "I was desperate." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "You were always desperate, Emily, and I was always here." There was nothing left to say. Emily left without looking back. The house fell silent. A different kind of silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but of resolution. Margaret gathered the papers from the table, washed the teacups, and sat on the sofa. Outside, the afternoon continued as normal. Neighbors passing, children playing, and she, finally, breathing. In the months that followed, Margaret's life didn't become easier. It became more honest. The marriage was quietly annulled. The community talked, as it always does. Some drifted away. Others surprisingly drew closer. Women who had been through similar situations and had never found words for it. The health issues demanded attention. Appointments, tests, adjustments. Margaret faced everything alone, but also without anyone getting in the way. She moved into a smaller apartment, sold furniture she didn't need, simplified. Emily never reached out. Daniel left town, and the inheritance, that small sum that had motivated so much betrayal, remained intact, now guarded with much greater care. Margaret hadn't won the way she once dreamed, but she had stopped something that could have destroyed the little she had left. Sometimes, that is enough. Margaret Collins didn't become a different person after everything. She remained the same discreet woman, punctual on Sundays, kind to her neighbors. But there was something different in her eyes. She learned that true love never requires you to shrink yourself to exist. That family isn't just blood, it's choice, respect, and reciprocity, and that it's never too late to break a cycle that always drained more than it built. At 67, Margaret finally learned to say no, and discovered that this simple word had always been her greatest protection. If Margaret's story touched your heart, leave a comment down below. We'd love to know what city you're watching from. You'd be surprised how many people across the country follow these stories together. And if you know someone who has been through something similar, share this video. Sometimes the right story arrives at exactly the right moment. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, consider doing it now. It's free, it's quick, and it helps us keep bringing real stories like Margaret's every single week. Until the next story.